What if I told you $7 trillion just moved between institutions in the span of weeks, and not a single major outlet explained what it means? Not because they didn't notice, because they can't afford to tell you this isn't a transfer, it's a repositioning. And it happened so quietly that by the time you hear about it on the news, the people who orchestrated it will already be on the other side of what comes next. $7 trillion. That's not a headline number thrown around for shock. That's the actual estimated value of assets that have silently rotated out of public-facing markets and into private credit, hard assets, and offshore structured vehicles in the last quarter alone. The mechanism? Reverse repos, institutional buybacks, sovereign bond shifts, and what's politely called liquidity management. The translation? The largest wealth transfer in modern history is happening in real time, and it's designed to be invisible until it's irreversible. Here's why this matters. $7 trillion is more than the GDP of Japan. It's more than the combined market cap of Apple, Microsoft, and Google. And it didn't evaporate. It didn't vanish into thin air. It moved. Deliberately, systematically. And the institutions that moved it did so because they know something the public balance sheets aren't showing yet. You need to understand how this works. When you hear the Federal Reserve is managing liquidity, what that actually means is this. Large banks and institutions are parking cash overnight with the Fed in exchange for Treasury securities. It's called a reverse repurchase agreement. On paper, it's boring. In practice, it's the single most telling signal of institutional fear in the entire financial system. Because when banks would rather earn next to nothing with the Fed than lend that money into the real economy, they're not being cautious. They're bracing. And in the last 6 months, reverse repo balances have collapsed from highs near $2.5 trillion down toward zero. That money didn't go back into your local credit market. It didn't flood into small business loans or consumer spending. It went somewhere else. Offshore credit funds, private equity structures, commodity-linked instruments, real estate held through non-disclosed LLCs, gold that never gets reported to an exchange. This is the $7 trillion. And it's not sitting idle. It's being positioned for the next phase. Here's the part they're not explaining. This kind of movement doesn't happen by accident. It doesn't happen because of sentiment or analyst predictions. It happens because the people with access to the real data, the overnight funding data, the interbank lending rates, the actual credit stress indicators, have seen something that hasn't been priced into public markets yet. And they've made a decision. Get out of paper. Get into real. You're watching the smart money do exactly what it did in early 2008. Exactly what it did before the dot-com collapse. Exactly what it did before Black Monday in 1987. It rotates out of inflated, sentiment-driven, leverage-dependent markets and into structures that survive what comes after. The difference this time is scale. $7 trillion is not a hedge. It's a full systemic pivot. And the media is silent, not because they don't know, because their incentives are tied to market stability, to consumer confidence, to add revenue from the very institutions executing this transfer. If CNBC ran a headline that said major banks repositioning for collapse, the collapse would start that day. So instead, you get soft language. You get profit taking. You get sector rotation. You get healthy correction. What you don't get is the truth, that the largest players in the global financial system have quietly exited the risk they spent the last decade selling you. Let's talk about why this is irreversible. Once institutional money moves at this scale, it doesn't come back into public markets unless there's a reason to believe those markets will perform. And right now, every structural indicator says the opposite. Corporate debt is at all-time highs. Profit margins are compressing. Consumer credit delinquency is rising. Real wages are flat. The housing market is frozen. And the only thing holding equity markets near record highs is buyback programs funded by the same debt that's starting to roll over at higher rates. So when $7 trillion quietly rotates out, it's not a bet against one sector. It's a bet against the illusion that this market is supported by growth, the illusion that central banks can keep intervening without consequence, the illusion that you can run an economy on credit expansion forever without eventually hitting the moment when the credit stops expanding. And that moment is closer than the headlines suggest, because the money has already moved. Here's what happens next. Once enough institutional capital is repositioned, the narrative will shift, not before. The same analysts who told you everything was fine will suddenly discover concerns. The same outlets that stayed silent will run investigative pieces on systemic risk. The same banks that rotated out will offer to help you navigate the volatility for a fee. But by then, it's too late. Because the transfer already happened, the people who are supposed to lose have already been chosen, and it's everyone still holding the paper. This is not speculation. This is how every major financial reset works. Wealth doesn't disappear, it concentrates. And it concentrates in the hands of the people who saw it coming early enough to move before the exits got crowded. $7 trillion is not money leaving the system. It's money changing ownership, from public to private, from transparent to opaque, from you to them. You need to understand the psychology here. The reason this transfer can happen silently is because the average person has been conditioned to believe that if something major was happening, they'd be told, that the news would cover it, that regulators would step in, that someone in authority would sound the alarm, but that's not how it works. The alarm doesn't sound until after the people with access have already moved, and by the time you hear the alarm, you're hearing the consequences, not the warning. This is the architecture of every engineered crisis. Create complexity so the public can't follow. Use technical language so it sounds boring. Execute the transfer slowly enough that no single day looks catastrophic. And then, when the reset happens, act surprised. Express concern, promise reform, and start the cycle again. 7 trillion is the number. Silence is the strategy. And the outcome is already locked in. Because once this much capital has repositioned, the market it left behind is no longer supported by real demand. It's supported by inertia. And inertia doesn't last. Here's the part that should terrify you. This isn't about one country. This isn't about one asset class. The 7 trillion that moved is global. It's rotating out of dollar-denominated risk and into hard assets, foreign credit structures, and instruments that perform in exactly the kind of environment that destroys public portfolios. Gold, silver, energy infrastructure, farmland, sovereign debt from creditor nations, not debtor nations. This is the playbook. And it's been executed in silence because silence is the only way to execute it without triggering the panic that makes it impossible. You're living through the early stage of a wealth transfer that will define the next decade. And the reason it feels calm right now is because the transfer is happening in boardrooms, not headlines. In offshore accounts, not stock tickers. In legal structures designed to be invisible until they're untouchable. The media is silent because their job is not to inform you early. Their job is to manage your behavior until it no longer matters. And right now, your behavior still matters. If enough people understood what 7 trillion moving actually means, they'd start asking questions. They'd start moving their own capital. They'd start demanding transparency. And that would disrupt the very transfer that's already in motion. So instead, you get distraction. Political theater, celebrity scandals, debates about inflation that never address the money supply, debates about market corrections that never address leverage, debates about economic growth that never address where the growth is actually going. And while you're debating, the transfer continues. This is not a conspiracy. This is incentive structure. The people moving 7 trillion are not evil. They're rational. They have access to data you don't. They have legal structures you can't use. They have time horizons longer than your next paycheck. And they've made a decision based on math, not hope. Here's the math. If you're holding assets that require stability, liquidity, and confidence to maintain value, and the institutions that create stability, liquidity, and confidence have quietly exited, your assets are now dependent on a system that no longer has support. That's not opinion. That's structure. And structure doesn't care about sentiment. The 7 trillion didn't move because someone got scared. It moved because someone got certain. Certain that the next phase is contraction, not expansion. Certain that the next move is reset, not recovery. Certain that the math doesn't work anymore and the only rational play is to be positioned in what survives math, not what survives narrative. And the media is silent because once this becomes public knowledge, the reset accelerates. So they'll stay silent until the acceleration is unavoidable. And then they'll cover it like it was unpredictable, like no one saw it coming, like it's a natural cycle instead of an engineered outcome. But you're seeing it now. You're seeing it because the number is too large to hide and the silence is too obvious to ignore. $7 trillion doesn't move quietly unless it's supposed to. Unless the people moving it understand that the moment it becomes loud, the game changes, and they're not ready for the game to change yet. Here's what you need to remember. Wealth transfers don't announce themselves. They happen in the gap between what's reported and what's real. And right now, that gap is $7 trillion wide. The institutions have moved, the media has stayed silent, and the outcome is already in motion. This isn't something that might happen. This is something that's happening. The only question left is whether you are on the side that moved early or the side that finds out late. The math is already locked in. The capital is already rotated. And the silence? The silence is the signal. So here's my question for you. If 7 trillion moved and no one told you, what else are they not telling you? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's see who's paying attention. This has been the architecture of the transfer. Thanks for watching.